Hey everyone. Okay, so in the first lesson, we looked at a front view and we looked at building from very simple ideas up to more complex ideas as the drawing developed. Today, we're going to look at a back view using the same approach, and we're going to look at some of the basic anatomical considerations that we'll need to know for the back view. As I emphasized in the first video, I don't want to get into a detailed analysis of anatomy, but let's look at the things that we really need to know, and then we can look at the things that will be nice to know, all right? So let's start off, as we did last time. The first thing I'm looking for is the relationship between the upper and the lower torso. Why the upper and the lower torso? Because they're the largest forms of the body, and they're going to tell me the most about the pose. So upper torso is the box there, lower torso here, using simple shapes, because right now I'm just concerned about the overall pose. What's the pose saying? What's the relationship between the different forms of the body and the proportion of those? So same thing as last time, a supporting leg coming down this time, down here, supporting the weight and the balance of the upper and the lower torso. And now let's just get in the spine. The spine's going to be coming down something like this. So I'm looking for the relationship, obviously between the upper and the lower torso, but I'm looking at the axis of each. What direction is this is the shoulders moving in relationship to the hips? So this line against this line. Once again, getting tension on this side, getting extension on this side. Hopefully starting to create some dynamics in the drawing very early on, right? So this leg is actually going forward, away from me slightly, and then coming back this way. So for me, with the back starts at what's called the occipital ridge, which is this little bump at the back of your head. We all have it. You can feel it back there. And that's where the spine connects to the skull. And it's also where a muscle called the trapezius attaches to the skull and then moves down in this direction. So I really want to know where that occipital ridge is, right there. Now the reality is, unless the model's bald, you're not going to be able to see it. So this is one of those cases where it's really useful to know where it is. And for me, I draw it regardless of whether I can see it or not, because as I said, I need something to attach the anatomy of the back to, at least up here. I need somewhere to attach the trapezius to. So if I understand that that's where the top, at least for me, where the top of the back starts, then I can start to work my way out from there with the anatomy and understand that I'll have a good foundation for that. So it starts up here, the spine comes down this way, and it stops down here at something called the sacrum. Sacrum's a very odd little shaped bone, but in its simplest idea, it's useful to think of it in terms of a triangle, something like that. Now here and here, you'll see on a lot of models, you'll see these little dimples. I think they're called sacral dimples. And I like to attach those two with a line coming across this way, because it also helps reinforce the axis of the pelvis, okay? So out from here, the iliac crest will be moving up in this direction, and then it'll be going around the form, and it'll be attaching at the front or working its way through the form to the front, meeting at the acis, which we discussed in the first video. Same thing on this side, the iliac crest coming around, and it's going to be attaching at the front. Okay, something like that. Moving down, the bottom of the sacrum right here is where the mass of the buttocks start. So I can start to think in terms of bringing in the mass of the buttocks down here. Now, they actually will be sitting lower than this line that represents the bottom of our pelvis. So I want to think in those terms. So that mass sitting in here, and this mass because this leg is going forward, there might be a slight stretch on this side. So they won't necessarily just be right next to each other, or you're mirroring each other on each side of the form. And we'll refine that as we move through the drawing. Once again, simple idea for the upper leg would be a tapered cylinder, something like this. And just as we did in the last video, I'm going to use more of an anatomical idea for the calf, just because for me that seems to make sense. And keep in mind that the calf muscle actually attaches to the femur above the knee. So I want to be thinking in those terms, even at this stage, that's going to be coming down this way, down to the Achilles tendon down here. Same thing on this side. It's going to be doing something like this. Now, as we discussed in the first video, if we're looking at using cylinders as large ideas to understand where things sit in space, if a cylinder is coming towards us or coming away from us, then we have the very useful tool of being able to take that cylinder, and as we did in the first video, the cylinder was coming towards us, and so we ended up with a form something like that. In this case, this leg is actually going away from us slightly in this direction. So our cylinder will also be moving away from us, something like this. Remember, we put the lines just to show the direction of the form, or the volume of the form. In this case, those lines will be moving in the opposite direction, something like that. So now I can understand in very simple terms, because obviously we're looking at three-dimensional ideas on a two-dimensional surface, right? So this allows me to think about this volume moving away from me in space, this one coming towards me. In this case, it's static, and our cylinder is just simply going down. Something like that. So I'm always thinking in these volumetric terms when I'm drawing. And I will very often put these lines on the drawing to help me understand which direction something is moving in space. Because I find it just helps mentally kind of adjust and help the process of moving things in space. So I might just very likely, and it's not an extreme turn, but I might just very likely want to say, okay, well, this one's moving away from me. Something like that. Okay, calf muscle, once again, attached above the knee here. So the mass of the calf is going to be coming out in this direction, something like so. I want to be thinking about the great trochanter, which is sitting approximately here and here. And there's a nice little graphic idea that we can employ at this point, especially just for this area here, where we're thinking almost, you could say, like a butterfly effect. See the way where that looks almost like the wings of a butterfly. Same thing on this side. We get this type of effect. That's just where the gluteus maximus is getting kind of pulled in, where it's attaching across the great trochanter. So I've always found this a useful kind of graphic symbol to be looking for as I draw this general area. You can almost see where now we have like a plane change. So we have the mass here, but then we have a plane change where it gets flatter in here. So something to keep in mind. I've just found it to be very useful. So moving up through the form, let's give a little bit more of a complex shape to this rib cage. Something like this. We're going to still keep it very simple. Now, excuse me, unlike the front, where everything's relatively static, the back has the scapula, which are the shoulder blades. Arm moves forward on the form. The scapula almost comes to the side of the body. Both arms go back like this. Scapula tend to get compressed very much towards the spine. So I'm looking for that scapula. It's one of the main ideas that I'm looking for, because obviously the arms are connected to it. And so it's very useful for me to understand where the scapula is sitting on the back. Sometimes it'd be quite tricky to locate, but you can get a general idea just from kind of deduction of where the arm is and how certain forms are sitting. They can give you a sense of, okay, that's the scapula there. As with everything else, I want to work from simple to more complex. The simplest idea I can have for the scapula would be essentially a triangle. So I'm going to have a triangle coming up this way. This arm is, say, going up here. On this side, that triangle, this representing the scapula, is going to be a little more relaxed. Maybe this arm is coming down this way, like so. Okay, so we now are starting once again to go from from simple to more complex, right? Coming in, the trapezius attached to this occipital ridge are going to be coming down in this direction. And it's actually, the trapezius is attached to the clavicle, the collarbone, and it's attached to the scapula. On the side here, we have this little like dimple that you can feel right here. It's attached to that, and it's also attached to the back edge of the scapula. So with that in mind, I'm coming in this way. I know that that little flat plane of the scapula is going to be sitting here. So I want to come down and I want to attach something like that. I want to think about the deltoid, the muscle of the shoulder. Once again, attached to the clavicle at the front and to the scapula. So I'm thinking about that mass, just in very general, loose terms, sitting in here, something like that. Can always refine these ideas later, but I just want to roughly get something in place. On this side, because this arm is down and relaxed, it's going to be sitting more like so. And then I can maybe think, okay, well, the tricep is coming up this way and the bicep is doing something like that. Working with a straight against the curve, because the tricep, generally speaking, even when up like this, the tricep tends to hang kind of like a hammock, right? It's attached at the elbow, it's attached up to the upper arm, but it seems it kind of hangs loose in the middle. Whereas the bicep, especially when the arm is extended, it's quite taut, it's under tension, and it's long, flat muscle. So I want to get a sense for that here and here to show the difference between the two, showing tension against something that's relaxed, showing a straight against a curve. From a design perspective, that's something that I'm trying to achieve. Okay, so we've got something like this. Now, if I take the occipital ridge back here and I follow my finger around from there, just from the underneath of the occipital ridge, and I come round, as you can see, it cuts just to like the top third of my ear. So with that in mind, I know that my ear is going to be sitting roughly in here, and I can just very likely indicate the form of the skull. Maybe I can see the front plane of the face there. So I just very likely want to just kind of get a sense of where that's going to be, something like that. I've got a muscle called the latissimus, which is a large muscle of the back, and when we talk about back anatomy in detail, we'll get into that. But the latissimus is attached to the humerus up here, and the latissimus kind of comes down this way like so, and it actually comes across the form like this, does the same on this side. Very large muscle, but we will see it, and we'll see the scapula kind of pushing that latissimus out slightly, giving it more volume and mass. Same on this side, we're just going to see the latissimus muscle in here. Once again, the scapula kind of pushing that volume out. We're going to use the obliques, as we did in the first lesson, to attach the upper and the lower torso. So with that in mind, that oblique comes down this way and it attaches to the iliac crest here, something like that. Now on this side it's quite stretched, but on this side there's going to be a certain amount of compression. So we're going to want to illustrate that in our drawing. Attached to the iliac crest, coming down this way. There's a fat pad on females especially that will sit around where the hips are, and the bulk of it actually tends to sit slightly lower than this great trochanter, but you can just we can just start to roughly indicate where that will be in here, something like that. Without getting into too much detail about anatomy right now, there's a couple of things that are useful to know. Attached to the sacrum here and to the iliac crest, the hip bone here, there are actually 4 muscles, rope-like muscles, that move their way up the form in this direction. And so what that tends to do is it gives us an effect almost like a valley. So we have something like this, right? And then we come around the form like this. And it creates shadow because the spine is actually sitting in the middle of that valley, right? Now there's 4 of them. Generally speaking, you tend to just see this as 2 volumetric ideas. You don't tend to see those 4 muscles as individual muscles, but that will help you bring, and as they go up here, they branch out and they get quite thin, and they are layered underneath the latissimus, further up underneath the trapezius. So we don't tend to see them up there, but we do see them down here. So it's useful for us to illustrate those. Okay, so things are roughly where I want them at this point. We can just kind of rough in the trapezius, which we're going to see back here, coming down to the elbow joint. It's going to be sitting something like this, and then the forearm coming down this way. And as I've said before, in classes to come, we'll discuss all of these ideas in more detail. Right now, we're looking at what's kind of like almost like the minimum we can get away with. Then we can talk about the subtleties and the details of each one of these ideas as we move forward. Okay, upper lower torso, everything's kind of roughly where I want it now. So now it's really about going in and making that final statement with line rather than working with this more lighter kind of tonal idea. And as you may recall from the first class, I talk about a checklist. I'm going through mentally asking myself, what is it that I'm drawing? I've just found it to just be a very useful kind of concept. So I might start here and I'll say, okay, I got my oblique sitting in here, coming up this way. Then I'm going to have a direction change for the rib cage coming up here. Then my latissimus and scapula sitting up here, coming into my tricep, coming up this way. Okay. Work my way down the form, thinking about, okay, I've got that great trochanter sitting there, and then I've got that fat pad, and now I'm coming down to the hamstring system, and when I'm done with the hamstring system, I have the knee system. So I've got to think like, okay, what's the next thing? As you get more experience with this, obviously you won't have to literally spell out each particular form that you're drawing. You'll have a more intuitive sense for it. But I found it, especially starting out, it's kind of useful to ask yourself, what is it that I'm drawing? So here, oblique, sitting in here. Once again, a little bit more compressed than on this side. Coming into the rib cage and coming into that latissimus slash scapula, sitting in there, something like that. Moving down the form into the pelvis area, coming down, fat pad, hamstring muscle, knee system. The buttocks starting at the bottom of the sacrum here, so we'll just come in and now we'll just start to give a final idea to that mass on that side. Once again, this one might be coming forward, ever so slightly, something like that, or stretched, sorry. There's a fat pad here on the upper thigh. Oh. Then we come down, hamstring system, knees. Maybe see a little bit of this thigh coming in here, down to the knee there. Calf muscle coming in this direction. Something like that, down to the Achilles tendon, then down to the heel of the foot down here. We're also probably going to see our ankle in here, something like that. On this side, slightly lower. Calf muscle coming down and attaching down here. One might want to illustrate where that volume of the calf is in here, so we understand that as a volumetric idea. Calf muscle coming down, once again. Achilles tendon, down to the heel. Calf muscle coming down, and same thing, just what's this volume look like? Something like that. Now, one other little thing from an anatomical point of view, which I think is kind of useful to understand, is the trapezius at the back here, up towards the neck, they tend to thin out. The trapezius thins out in this area here. And what that does is you almost get like this, you could say it's almost like a little triangle effect, something sitting like this. Certainly won't be this kind of obvious on the model. But what it does is it exposes what's called C7 and T1, which is the two vertebrae that you're very likely to see on most models. On a very lean model, very athletic model, you certainly may see more vertebrae. These two you tend to see almost, I won't say completely regardless of weight, but they do tend to show themselves. And what you tend to get here is like a little dip in here like this, flat, and then something like that. Once again, something to be mindful of when you get to the light and tone stage of the drawing. So the trapezius on this side, this arm is up, the trapezius is a little bit more bunched up here. So I just want to kind of try and show that a little bit on that side, something like that. Whereas on this side, that trapezius is coming down and it's a little calmer, coming down into the deltoid down here. Deltoid up here, showing its volume here, before we then get into that very kind of straight idea for the bicep. Just show some of the tricep in here, coming down this way, the elbow system in here, coming down to the forearm, like so. And we'll discuss all of these anatomical ideas in more depth as we move on through the different sessions. Something to keep in mind, as we've discussed before, when we come to joints, elbows, knees, wrists, etc., things tend to get a little boxier, where the bones come to the surface of the form. Things get more angular. So for example, we have quite a roundness to the forearm up here, but then when we come down to the wrist, things start to get much squarer. So as you can see here, this is a relatively flat plane compared to up here, and we have quite a sharp edge, whereas that idea softens at the further we get up the forearm. You'll notice the same type of idea with knees, ankles. Anywhere there's a joint, really, where the bone is coming to the surface, you'll start to see more of a squaring out of the form. So you can think kind of thigh, soft, round, knee, boxier. It's the way I like to kind of think about it. Okay, so now I've been thinking volumetrically, it'll be relatively straightforward for me to think about the forms turning in space and where we're going to go from light into shadow. So just very quickly, with that in mind, I might say to myself, for example, okay, well, if the light is coming from up here, something like this, well then this may be all lit, but then as the form turns, I'm going to have a core shadow here, and then this part will be coming into shadow. Might have what's called a cast shadow under here, which is generally a darker shadow than, say, the reflected light or the core shadow up here. The cast shadow is obviously a shadow that's being cast by this buttock. So I can go through the form using something called conceptual light, where I make up the ideas of the relationships between light and tone, rather than maybe relying on what's going on with the model, especially if the model's in a room full of fluorescent lights with multiple directions of light. It's going to be very hard to find a simple relationship between the lit side of the form and the shadow side of the form. And in my experience, the simpler you keep those relationships between the lit side of the form and the side of the form that's in shadow, generally speaking, the more successful your drawing will be. So we'll talk about light and tone another time, but I can go through now, even without reference in front of me, and kind of get a sense of asking myself, okay, where is the form turning, and where is something going to be in light, and where's it going to be in shadow? And I can start to add tone accordingly. That's one of the great advantages about thinking volumetrically, and rather than thinking just graphically as far as a series of shapes and lines, because I'm thinking about the form turning in space. Then when I get to the lighting stage, there's a very logical kind of approach to asking myself, where is something in light? Where is something in shadow? And I can add my shadows accordingly. Okay, so we work from simple to more complex. As we develop our understanding and our knowledge of anatomy, the more informed choices we can make and the more we can apply those subtleties to our drawing. But learning anatomy takes time. So don't stress if you feel like you don't understand all the anatomy yet. You'll learn it as time goes on, and then you'll be able to apply those incrementally, those ideas to your drawing as you go. Keeping in mind, starting very simple, getting those proportions right early on. Be very, very difficult to start changing proportion, obviously, at this stage in the drawing. But if we start that early and we catch it early, then as the drawing develops, we can move forward with a certain amount of confidence. Okay? So I hope this helps. Please let me know if you have any questions, anything that you might like me to address in these videos. And I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.